I pressed my tear-stained face against the silk blouses hanging in Mr. Valentino's private office closet, desperately trying to muffle my sobs with the expensive fabric that probably cost more than my entire month's rent, when the door suddenly swung open and flooded me with harsh fluorescent light that made me squeeze my eyes shut in pure mortification. Standing there in the doorway, filling the entire frame with his 6'3" presence that always made the air feel thinner and more dangerous, was Dante Valentino himself, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, the man whose coffee I prepared every morning at exactly 7:15, the man whose cold gray eyes could make grown men weep, holding a gun in one hand and his phone in the other, his expression shifting from lethal alertness to something I'd never seen cross his devastatingly handsome face before. Genuine, unfiltered concern. For 8 months, I had maintained the perfect facade of the efficient, unshakable secretary. The woman who never flinched when blood-stained men walked through our office doors, who never asked questions about the briefcases full of cash, or the hushed conversations about territories and shipments, who kept my eyes down and my hands steady even when my boss's dangerous world crashed against the walls of our shared space like violent waves against fragile glass. I had been so careful, so meticulously professional, organizing his chaotic empire with color-coded files and perfectly timed reminders, keeping my inappropriate attraction to him buried so deep beneath layers of business suits and polite smiles that I sometimes almost convinced myself it didn't exist at all. But now everything was crumbling around me like a house of cards in a hurricane, and the one person I never wanted to see me broken was staring at me with an intensity that made my already racing heart threaten to burst right through my ribcage. "Ilara," he said, and the way my name rolled off his tongue in that deep, commanding voice that usually barked orders about eliminating problems and handling situations made something inside my chest crack even wider, because there was a gentleness there that I'd never heard before, a softness that seemed impossible coming from a man who reportedly once killed 3 rivals with his bare hands in a warehouse downtown. He stepped into the closet, which suddenly felt impossibly small with his broad shoulders and muscular frame taking up all the oxygen, and I watched through blurred vision as he tucked his gun into the holster at his hip, with practiced ease before reaching out with one large, calloused hand to grip my chin with surprising tenderness, tilting my face up so I had no choice but to meet those storm cloud eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd ever built. "Who made you cry, and how would you like their body disposed of?" The question should have terrified me, should have reminded me exactly what kind of man I worked for, what kind of darkness lived behind those expensive Italian suits, and that calculating gaze, but instead something warm and desperate unfurled in my stomach. Because for the first time in my entire life, someone was offering to shoulder my burdens, to eliminate my problems with the kind of permanent efficiency that only a man like Dante Valentino could provide. I opened my mouth to lie, to brush it off as nothing, to maintain the professional distance that had kept me safe and employed for these past 8 months. But the words died in my throat when I saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his free hand curled into a fist at his side, as if he was physically restraining himself from hunting down whoever had caused my tears. And I realized with startling clarity that lying to him right now would be impossible, because he would see through it the way he saw through everything else. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Mr. Valentino," I managed to whisper, even though my voice cracked halfway through and fresh tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and humiliating against my skin. "It's personal. It's my problem to handle, and I apologize for breaking down in your office during work hours. It was completely unprofessional, and it won't happen again." His eyes narrowed dangerously, and I watched his expression shift into something darker, something that reminded me exactly why rival gangs crossed the street when they saw him coming, why his name was whispered in Chicago's underworld with a mixture of respect and terror that bordered on religious. "Ilara Bennett," he said slowly, deliberately, as if he was explaining something to a child who didn't quite understand the rules of the world. "In the 8 months you've worked for me, you have never once been late, never once filed something incorrectly, never once flinched when violence walked through our doors, and never once shown me anything but perfect composure even when lesser people would have run screaming from this office. He crouched down then, lowering himself so we were eye to eye, and the movement was so unexpected, so unlike the commanding boss who never made himself vulnerable or small for anyone, that I stopped breathing altogether. So when I find you hiding in my closet, crying like your world is ending, it becomes my problem whether you want it to be or not, because you are mine to protect, do you understand? The possessiveness in his tone should have sent warning bells ringing through my head, should have reminded me that this was a dangerous man who owned people and places and entire sections of the city, who didn't understand boundaries because he'd never needed to respect them. But instead, I felt something inside me break completely, like a dam that had been holding back months of stress and fear and exhaustion, finally giving way under impossible pressure. My sister, I choked out, the words tumbling from my lips before I could stop them, before I could remember all the reasons why dragging Dante Valentino into my messy, complicated disaster of a personal life was the worst possible decision I could make. Maya, she's only 19, and she's being held by the Sergei Volkov gang because of our father's gambling debts that he accumulated before he died and left us with nothing but his mistakes and his enemies, and they want $500,000 that I don't have, that I could never have even if I worked for you for the next 10 years. I watched his expression transform from concern to something absolutely murderous, his features hardening into a mask of cold fury that made my blood run cold and hot simultaneously, and his hand tightened slightly on my chin. Not enough to hurt, but enough to keep me anchored to him, to this moment, to the decision I'd just made by speaking those words aloud. "How long have they had her?" he asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that probably preceded violence in most situations, the kind of tone that made smart people start talking very quickly about everything they knew. 3 days, I admitted, shame flooding through me because what kind of sister was I, working in this office surrounded by power and money and resources, while my baby sister sat in some filthy warehouse at the mercy of monsters who saw her as nothing more than collateral. They send me pictures every morning to prove she's alive, to remind me that the clock is ticking, and I've been trying to figure out how to get the money, how to save her without involving the police because they made it very clear what would happen if I did. But I have nothing, Mr. Valentino. I have absolutely nothing except this job and a sister who's going to die because I can't protect her. For a long moment, Dante said nothing, just stared at me with those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to be calculating something far beyond my understanding, running through scenarios and options with the brilliant, ruthless mind that had built an empire from blood and bullets and strategic brilliance. Then, slowly, deliberately, he released my chin and stood to his full height, pulling his phone from his pocket with movements that were casual and terrifying in their confidence. And I watched from my position huddled among his expensive clothes as he pressed a single button and lifted the device to his ear. "Marco," he said simply, and I recognized the name of his second-in-command, the scary man with the facial scar who always stood 3 steps behind Dante like a lethal shadow. "Gather everyone, full mobilization. We're going to war with the Volkov organization, and I want every location they operate out of identified within the hour." My heart stopped completely in my chest. Panic and disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to hope warring inside me as I scrambled to my feet, nearly tripping over the designer shoes I'd kicked off in my distress. "Mr. Valentino, you can't. I didn't tell you this so you would start a war. I just needed to explain why I was falling apart, why I couldn't hold it together anymore." I protested frantically, reaching out to grab his arm without thinking, my fingers wrapping around solid muscle beneath the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "The Volkov gang is dangerous. Everyone knows they're vicious and unpredictable, and I can't be responsible for you putting yourself and your men at risk over something that's my problem to solve." He ended the call without another word, sliding the phone back into his pocket before turning to face me fully. And the expression on his face made my knees weak because it was possessive and protective, and absolutely uncompromising in a way that spoke of decisions already made and consequences be damned. "Let me make something very clear to you, Alara," he said, stepping closer until I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, until I could smell his cologne mixing with something darker, something that was purely him. "I have been watching you for 8 months, studying the way you move through this office like grace personified, noticing how you never complain even when you're clearly exhausted, seeing the way you stretch your paychecks to cover expenses I can only guess at, and wanting you with an intensity that frankly concerns even me." His hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing away tears with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. "So when you tell me that someone has taken your sister, has threatened your family, has put that broken look in your eyes that's currently destroying me from the inside out, you need to understand that it's not your problem anymore, it's mine. Because everything that's yours belongs to me now, whether you've realized it yet or not." The words should have frightened me, should have sent me running from this closet and this office and this dangerous man who spoke about ownership like it was romance. But instead I found myself leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun, desperate and grateful and terrified all at once. "Why?" I whispered, because I needed to understand, needed to know what motivated a man like Dante Valentino to risk everything for a secretary he barely knew beyond her organizational skills and coffee preferences. "Why would you do this for me?" His smile was dark and beautiful, and full of promises that probably should have terrified me, but instead made heat pool low in my stomach. "Because, Alara Bennett, from the moment you walked into my office for your interview wearing that nervous smile and that determination in your eyes, acting like you weren't at all intimidated by the fact that everyone told you I was a monster, I've been completely and utterly obsessed with you," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate rumble that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. "And obsessed men do very dangerous, very permanent things to protect what they consider theirs. So tell me their name. Tell me exactly where they're holding your sister, and I promise you that by morning, the Volkov organization will regret the day they ever touched anything that belongs to me." I stared up at him, my mind reeling from the confession, from the intensity in his eyes, from the casual way he spoke about violence and possession and obsession like they were romantic declarations, and I realized that I was standing at a crossroads where one path led back to my careful, controlled, safe existence, and the other led into darkness and danger and the terrifying protection of a man who could either save me or destroy me completely. "The Sergei Volkov gang has Maya in a warehouse on the south side, the one near the old factory district," I heard myself say, watching as something predatory and satisfied flickered across Dante's face. "And they want $500,000 delivered in 3 days, or they're going to kill her and dump her body in the river as a message to anyone else who thinks they can skip out on debts." Dante's expression darkened so completely that for a moment, I saw exactly what his enemies must see right before they died. A cold fury that promised retribution beyond anything imaginable. And then he was pulling me against his chest, wrapping his arms around me with a possessiveness that felt like being claimed, like being marked as his in some fundamental way that couldn't be undone. "Then we have 3 days to teach them exactly what happens when someone touches what belongs to Dante Valentino," he murmured against my hair, his voice carrying promises of violence and protection in equal measure. "And Alara, I need you to understand something before we walk out of this closet and into what comes next. You're not my secretary anymore. You're under my protection, in my care, and very soon, in my bed. Because I've been waiting 8 months for an excuse to make you mine, and you just handed me the perfect reason to never let you go." I couldn't believe what I'd done, couldn't process the fact that I'd just involved the most dangerous man in Chicago in my family's disaster. And now, Dante Valentino was walking me through the underground parking garage, toward his private elevator, with his hand possessively pressed against my lower back, the heat of his palm burning through the thin fabric of my blouse like a brand, while 3 black SUVs filled with his armed men followed behind us with an efficiency that spoke of years of practiced coordination. My mind was still reeling from everything that had happened in that closet. from his confession that he'd been obsessed with me for 8 months, from the casual way he'd declared war on an entire criminal organization as if it was nothing more complicated than rescheduling a meeting. And I found myself walking in a daze, my body moving on autopilot while my thoughts spiraled in 1,000 different directions at once, trying to understand how my carefully controlled life had exploded so completely in the span of 20 minutes. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask, as the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing an interior that was all polished chrome and mirrors that reflected our images back at us. And I barely recognized the woman staring back at me with swollen eyes and disheveled hair, looking nothing like the composed secretary who'd arrived at work this morning with her usual professional armor firmly in place. Dante guided me inside with that same possessive touch, his large frame taking up space beside me in a way that made the spacious elevator feel intimate and confined. And I watched in the reflection as he pressed the button for the penthouse level, which I'd always known existed, but had never been invited to visit in all my months of working for him. "My penthouse," he said simply, as if it was the most obvious answer in the world, as if there was nowhere else we could possibly go in this moment. "You're not going back to your apartment where you're vulnerable and exposed, where any rival with a grudge could find you and use you to get to me. And you're certainly not staying alone tonight after everything you've just been through, so you'll stay with me where my security can monitor every entrance and exit, where I can personally ensure that nothing and no one touches you without going through me first." His tone left absolutely no room for argument, that commanding edge that I'd heard him use with his men countless times. But there was something else threaded through it now, something that sounded almost like concern, like genuine worry for my well-being, that made my chest tighten with emotions I wasn't ready to examine too closely. The elevator rose smoothly through the building, and I found myself leaning slightly against the wall, exhaustion suddenly crashing over me like a wave now that the adrenaline from my breakdown was fading, leaving me hollow and shaky and uncertain. "I need to tell you something," Dante said quietly, and I turned to look at him properly, taking in the sharp angles of his face, the slight stubble along his jaw that gave him a dangerous edge, the way his gray eyes seemed to soften slightly when they landed on me. "I've known about your father's debts for months now, known that you've been struggling to pay them off little by little with your salary, and I've had my men keeping an eye on you, making sure the collectors didn't get too aggressive, making sure you were safe even though you had no idea I was watching. The confession should have made me angry, should have felt like a violation of my privacy, but instead I felt something else entirely. A strange mixture of relief and wonder that someone had been looking out for me during the loneliest, most terrifying months of my life. "You've been having me followed?" I asked, and my voice came out softer than I intended, lacking any real accusation because, honestly, knowing that Dante's men had been shadowing me explained so much about why the debt collectors had suddenly backed off last month, why the threatening phone calls had stopped, why I'd been able to breathe just a little bit easier, even though the debt still loomed over me like a dark cloud. "I've been having you protected," he corrected, and the distinction seemed important to him, seemed to matter in some way that I didn't fully understand yet. "From the moment you walked into this building, looking so determined and brave despite being clearly terrified of me and everything I represent, I knew you were different. Knew you were someone worth keeping safe even if you didn't know you needed keeping." The elevator chimed again, announcing our arrival at the penthouse, and the doors slid open to reveal a space that was somehow both luxurious and surprisingly warm. All dark woods and leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering Chicago skyline like a kingdom spread out below us. Dante guided me inside, his hand never leaving my back, and I found myself standing in the middle of his living room, feeling completely out of place in my work clothes and tear-stained face, surrounded by wealth and power that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from my own small, struggling existence. "Sit," he instructed gently, directing me toward a massive leather sofa that probably cost more than my car, and I sank into it gratefully, my legs finally giving out after holding me up through sheer willpower for the past hour. He disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen, and I heard the sound of cabinets opening, water running, the domestic noises strange and surreal, coming from a man I'd only ever seen barking orders and making decisions that affected people's lives and deaths. When he returned, he was carrying a tray with tea and what looked like expensive shortbread cookies, and the sight of Chicago's most feared mafia boss playing host was so unexpected that I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat, which I quickly swallowed down because I was fairly certain that laughing at Dante Valentino was a poor life choice. "Chamomile," he said, setting the tray down on the coffee table before settling onto the sofa beside me, close enough that our thighs almost touched, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "My mother used to make it for me when I was upset, before she was killed by a rival family when I was 16. And I've kept the habit even though most people would probably find it amusing that someone like me drinks chamomile tea." The glimpse into his past, into the tragedy that had clearly shaped him into the man he'd become, made my heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with my own problems, and everything to do with the sudden understanding that Dante Valentino had experienced loss and pain just like everyone else, had been broken and rebuilt into something harder and more dangerous. "I'm sorry," I said softly, reaching for the delicate china cup and wrapping my hands around it, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. "I'm sorry about your mother, and I'm sorry that I brought my mess to your doorstep, and I'm sorry that you're going to war with the Volkov organization because I couldn't handle my own family's problems." His hand shot out and gripped my wrist with enough force to make me gasp, not painfully but firmly enough to demand my attention. And when I looked up at him, I saw something blazing in his eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. "Don't apologize for being human, for having problems, for needing help," he said fiercely, his thumb rubbing small circles on the inside of my wrist, where my pulse was hammering wildly. "And especially don't apologize for giving me exactly what I've been wanting for 8 months, which is a legitimate reason to keep you close, to protect you, to make you understand that you belong to me now in every way that matters." He released my wrist and stood abruptly, pacing toward the windows with barely contained energy, and I watched his reflection in the glass as he continued speaking. "Do you know why Volkov took your sister specifically? Why he chose now to call in your father's old debts, when he could have done it at any time in the past year?" I shook my head mutely, not trusting my voice to work properly, and took a sip of the tea, which was perfect. Exactly the right temperature and sweetness, because apparently Dante Valentino paid attention to details even in something as simple as making tea. "Because he knows you're my weakness," Dante said, turning back to face me, and the admission hung in the air between us like something tangible and dangerous. "Because word has gotten around in certain circles that I watch you, that I've had you protected, that I react badly when anyone even suggests touching you. And Volkov saw an opportunity to use you to get to me, to force my hand in a territory dispute we've been having for the past 6 months." He crossed back to the sofa and knelt in front of me, taking the teacup from my trembling hands and setting it aside before gripping both of my hands in his much larger ones. "So you see, Alara, this isn't your fault. This is mine, because my obsession with you has put a target on your back and on your sister's back. And now I have to fix it, have to eliminate the threat and make it absolutely clear to every criminal organization in this city that touching you or anyone you love is signing their own death warrant." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. The understanding that my sister's kidnapping wasn't just about old debts, but about me, about my connection to Dante, about the fact that somehow, without even realizing it, I'd become important to a man who didn't allow himself to care about anything or anyone. "I don't understand," I whispered, because I genuinely didn't. Couldn't comprehend why someone like him would fixate on someone like me when he could have anyone. Could, Have women who were more beautiful, more sophisticated, more suited to his dangerous world. I'm just your secretary, just someone who files your paperwork and answers your phone calls, so why would you be obsessed with me? Why would you put yourself at risk for someone so ordinary? His laugh was dark and rich, and he reached up to cup my face with both hands, holding me captive with his gaze and his touch. Elara Bennett, you are many things, but ordinary is not one of them, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate rumble that seemed to bypass my brain and go straight to some primal part of me that responded to him on a level I didn't fully understand. You walked into my world 8 months ago and brought light with you, brought kindness and warmth and a goodness that has no place in the darkness I inhabit. And instead of running like any sane person would, you stayed. You smiled at me like I was just a man instead of a monster, and you made me remember what it felt like to want something beyond power and control and revenge. His thumb stroked my cheekbones with devastating gentleness. So yes, I've been obsessed. I've been watching you and wanting you and waiting for my chance to make you mine. And now that chance has come even though the circumstances are terrible. And I'm not going to waste it by pretending I'm a good man who can let you go once this is over. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might actually explode, and I found myself leaning into his touch like I was starving for it. For him. For this connection that felt both terrifying and inevitable. What happens after you get Maya back? I asked, because I needed to know, needed to understand what he expected from me, what this protection would cost me in the end. What happens when the threat is eliminated and I'm safe again? His smile was possessive and predatory and full of dark promise. Then you move in here permanently. You let me take care of you the way I've been dying to for months, and you accept that you're mine now, Elara, in every possible way, he said. And before I could respond, before I could process the enormity of what he was suggesting, his phone buzzed with an incoming message that made his expression darken immediately. He released me and pulled out the device, his jaw clenching as he read whatever was on the screen. And I watched the transformation as the gentle, confessing man disappeared and the ruthless Mafia boss emerged in his place. Marco has located 3 of Volkov's main warehouses and confirmed that your sister is being held at the South Side location you mentioned, he said, his voice now cold and businesslike. He's also intercepted intelligence that suggests Volkov is planning to move her tomorrow morning to a secondary location that will be much harder to breach. Fear shot through me like ice water in my veins, and I stood abruptly, moving toward Dante without thinking. So what do we do? I asked, because somehow in the past hour, I'd gone from handling this alone to being part of a we that included Chicago's most dangerous criminal, and the shift felt both unnatural and surprisingly right. Dante's eyes met mine, and what I saw there made my blood run cold and hot simultaneously, a mixture of deadly intent and fierce protection that promised violence on my behalf. We're going to get your sister back tonight instead of waiting, he said, already typing out rapid instructions on his phone. I'm mobilizing every man I have, calling in favors from allies who owe me, and we're going to hit that warehouse with enough force that Volkov will regret ever hearing your name. He paused, looking up at me with an expression that was both a warning and a promise. But Elara, I need you to understand something before we do this. Before we cross this line together. Once I go to war for you, once I spill blood in your name and make you mine in the eyes of every criminal organization in this city, there's no going back to your normal life, no pretending that you're just my secretary, no walking away from me when this is over, because I don't let go of what's mine, ever. I stared at him, understanding exactly what he was offering and what it would cost me, the freedom and the safety and the ordinary existence I'd been clinging to. And I thought about Maya alone and terrified in that warehouse, about the life I'd been living in fear and exhaustion and loneliness, about the way Dante looked at me like I was something precious and worth protecting and utterly his. Then I guess there's no going back, I said quietly, and watched something triumphant and possessive flash across his face. Get my sister back, Dante, and I'm yours, whatever that means, whatever that costs me. He crossed to me in 2 long strides and kissed me then, hard and claiming and full of dark promise, his hands tangling in my hair as he took my mouth like he was sealing a bargain, like he was branding me as his in some fundamental way. And when he pulled back, we were both breathing hard, both understanding that everything had just changed irrevocably. "Get some rest," he ordered, his voice rough with barely controlled desire. "Because tonight we're going to war, and tomorrow you're going to wake up as mine in every way that matters. And Alara, I need you to be ready for what that means, for the darkness and the danger and the fact that I'm never going to let you go." He started toward the door, already calling his men, already planning the assault. And then he paused and looked back at me with an expression that was pure predator. "Oh, and one more thing you should know before tonight. Volkov just sent a message saying that if I want your sister back alive, I need to bring you to him personally for an exchange, which means he's planning to take you both, to use you against me. And that, my beautiful Ilara, was the last mistake he'll ever make." When Dante said I was under his protection, I didn't realize that meant attending his meeting with Volkov personally, didn't understand that I would find myself 2 hours later wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my yearly salary. The black silk clinging to curves I usually kept hidden beneath conservative work clothes, sitting on Dante's lap in a private room at an exclusive restaurant that served as neutral ground for Chicago's most vicious criminals, while his hand gripped my thigh in a possessive hold that left absolutely no doubt about who I belonged to. The room was filled with dangerous men, each one radiating the kind of violence that normal people crossed streets to avoid, and I could feel their eyes on me, assessing, calculating, trying to understand why Dante Valentino had brought his secretary to what was essentially a war council, why he was touching me with such blatant ownership, why he looked at me like I was something infinitely more valuable than the territories and money they were about to discuss. Sergei Volkov sat across from us at the mahogany table, his cold blue eyes studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching, because I understood instinctively that showing fear here would be like bleeding in shark-infested waters. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp Slavic features and an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the brutality underneath. And when he smiled at me, it was the kind of expression that promised pain and violation, the kind that made me unconsciously press closer to Dante's solid warmth. "So this is the famous Ilara Bennett," Volkov said in accented English, his voice smooth and cultured in a way that made the threat underneath even more disturbing. "The secretary who has managed to capture the attention of Chicago's most elusive bachelor, the woman worth starting a war over. And I must say, Dante, I understand the appeal even if I question the wisdom of bringing something so delicate and breakable to a negotiation like this." I felt Dante's hand tighten on my thigh, his fingers digging in just slightly, and I knew without looking that his expression had gone deadly, that Volkov's casual threat had triggered something violent and protective in the man whose lap I was currently occupying. "Careful, Sergei," Dante said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that I'd learned meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "You're already on thin ice by taking her sister, by thinking you could use Ilara to manipulate me, and making threats against her person while she's sitting in front of you is only going to accelerate the timeline of your organization's complete and total destruction." His other hand came up to rest possessively on my hip, and I could feel the tension radiating through his body, could sense how close he was to simply killing everyone in this room and dealing with the consequences later. Volkov leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering, and I realized with growing horror that he was enjoying this, was taking pleasure in pushing Dante's buttons, in seeing exactly how far he could go before the most dangerous man in Chicago snapped completely. "Let's discuss terms then, since we're all here for business," he said, gesturing lazily to one of his men, who stepped forward with a tablet, swiping through screens before turning it to face us. "Your sister is alive, and relatively unharmed, Miss Bennett, as you can see from these current video feeds, though I'm afraid her accommodations are not quite as luxurious as the penthouse you apparently spent last night in." The screen showed Maya, my beautiful baby sister with her dark hair matted and her face bruised, sitting in what looked like a concrete cell with her knees drawn up to her chest. And the sight of her like that made rage and guilt and helplessness surge through me so powerfully that I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. Dante must have felt my reaction because his hand moved from my thigh to wrap around my waist, pulling me even more firmly against him, and I felt his lips brush against my ear as he whispered words meant only for me. "Breathe, sweetheart. Just breathe and trust me, because I promise you that your sister will be safe and Volkov will pay for every bruise on her face. But right now, I need you to stay calm and let me handle this." The endearment, the gentle reassurance in his voice even as he faced down a rival crime lord, made something warm bloom in my chest despite the circumstances, and I nodded slightly to show I understood, leaning into his strength because right now it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. "What do you want, Volkov?" Dante asked, his voice cold and businesslike now, the tone he used when negotiating deals that would determine who lived and who died in Chicago's criminal underworld. "Name your price for releasing the girl unharmed, and be very careful about what you ask for, because my patience for this situation is wearing extremely thin, and when my patience runs out, people tend to die in very permanent and very public ways." Volkov's smile widened, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. The careful assessment of how far he could push, how much he could demand from a man who was clearly desperate to protect what he considered his. "I want the 3 districts on the south side that your organization currently controls, the ones with the profitable shipping routes and the warehouses that would give me access to the entire southern corridor," he said, ticking off his demands on his fingers like he was reading a grocery list rather than asking for territory worth millions of dollars. "I want your assurance that you won't retaliate against my organization for this unfortunate incident involving Miss Bennett's sister. And I want a guarantee that we can conduct our business in those districts without interference from your men for the next 5 years." He paused, and I watched his gaze slide over me in a way that made my stomach turn. "And I want one evening with your lovely secretary here. Just dinner and conversation, of course, as insurance that you'll honor our agreement and won't simply kill me the moment I release the sister." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and I felt Dante's entire body go rigid beneath me, felt the way his muscles tensed and coiled like a predator preparing to strike. And for a moment I genuinely thought he was going to kill Volkov right there at the negotiation table. Consequences be damned. "Absolutely not," he said, and his voice was so cold, so utterly devoid of anything resembling compromise, that even Volkov's men shifted uncomfortably. "You can have 1 district, not 3, and you can have my word that I won't kill you immediately after we conclude this business. But Alara doesn't leave my sight, doesn't leave my protection, and certainly doesn't spend 1 second alone with you or anyone else from your organization. So if that's your final offer, then this negotiation is over and we settle this the old-fashioned way." I knew what the old-fashioned way meant, knew it involved violence and bloodshed, and probably my sister dying in the crossfire, and I felt panic rising in my throat because I couldn't let that happen, couldn't let Maya pay the price for my connection to Dante Valentino. "I'll do it," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the terror coursing through my veins, and I felt Dante stiffen even further beneath me, felt his grip on my waist tighten to the point of pain. "I'll have dinner with Mr. Volkov if it means my sister goes free, if it means no one else has to die over my family's debts. And I'm sure 1 evening of conversation is a small price to pay for Maya's life." The moment the words left my mouth, Dante stood abruptly, taking me with him, his arm wrapped around my waist like a steel band as he lifted me effortlessly and set me on my feet before spinning me to face him. And the expression on his face was absolutely murderous, a fury so intense that I actually took a step back before I could stop myself. "We need to talk now, privately," he said through clenched teeth, and then without waiting for a response, he was pulling me toward a door at the back of the room, away from the table and the watching criminals, into what turned out to be a small private office that probably belonged to the restaurant owner, who was undoubtedly being paid handsomely to host these kinds of meetings. The moment the door closed behind us, Dante released me and spun away, his hands going to his hair as he paced like a caged animal, and I could see him struggling for control, fighting against instincts that probably involved extreme violence. "What the hell were you thinking?" he finally exploded, whirling back to face me with eyes that blazed with anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Did you seriously just volunteer to spend an evening alone with a man who would absolutely use that opportunity to hurt you, to violate you, to do things that would destroy you just to get back at me for years of territorial disputes?" He crossed to me in 2 long strides, gripping my shoulders with enough force that I knew I'd have bruises tomorrow. "I told you that you're mine, Alara, that I protect what's mine, and that means I'd rather lose every district I own, rather lose everything I've built, than let another man so much as breathe near you, let alone spend an evening doing God knows what while I'm forced to wait and imagine all the ways he could be hurting you." His passionate declaration, the raw emotion in his voice, made tears spring to my eyes because no one had ever cared about me like this, had ever put my safety above their own interests. And I reached up to grip his wrists, feeling his pulse racing beneath my fingers. "Then what do we do, Dante?" I asked desperately, because I was out of options, out of ideas, and all I could think about was Maya sitting in that cell, bruised and terrified and waiting for a rescue that might never come. "How do we save her without giving him what he wants? Because I don't see another way out of this situation, and I need you to tell me that there's a solution that doesn't involve my sister dying, or you losing everything you've worked for." He stared at me for a long moment, his chest heaving with barely controlled emotion. And then suddenly his expression shifted, transformed into something calculating and dangerous. And I watched as the fury gave way to the brilliant, strategic mind that had built a criminal empire from nothing. "There's another way," he said slowly, releasing my shoulders and beginning to pace again, but this time with purpose, with the energy of someone working through a complex problem. An old tradition that most organizations still honor because it's considered sacred, a way to settle disputes that goes back generations in our world. And if I invoke it, then Volkov will have no choice but to accept or lose all credibility with every other crime family in the city. Hope surged through me, desperate and fragile, and I moved closer to him, needing to understand. "What tradition?" I asked, watching as he pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly, presumably messaging his second-in-command with instructions I couldn't begin to guess at. "Trial by combat," he said, and my blood ran cold at the words, at the implications of what he was suggesting. "I challenge Volkov to a traditional fight, one-on-one, no weapons beyond what we can use with our bare hands, and the winner takes all. If I win, he releases your sister immediately, and backs off permanently from any claims on you or your family, and if he wins, he gets the districts he wants in you." He looked up from his phone, his gray eyes meeting mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "But here's the thing, Alara. Here's what I need you to understand. I don't lose. I've never lost a fight in my entire life because I fight like a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect. And right now, with you at stake, with the possibility of losing you to someone like Volkov, I'll fight like something possessed, like something beyond human, because the alternative is literally unthinkable." I should have protested, should have told him that I couldn't let him risk his life for me, that there had to be another way. But looking at the determination in his face, the absolute certainty that he would win, I found myself nodding slowly, understanding that this was the only solution that would satisfy both his need to protect me and the brutal requirements of his world. "When?" I whispered, because if this was happening, if Dante was going to fight for my sister's life and my freedom, then I needed to know how much time we had, how long I had to prepare myself for the possibility of watching him get hurt, or worse. 3 days, he said, already moving toward the door, already preparing to deliver his challenge to Volkov. "That's the traditional waiting period, Time for both fighters to prepare and for neutral parties to arrange the location and ensure fair terms. And I'll use every minute of those 3 days to make sure I'm ready, to make sure there's no possible outcome except me winning and you staying exactly where you belong, which is with me, under my protection, in my life permanently. He paused with his hand on the door handle, looking back at me with an expression that was equal parts possessive and vulnerable. But I need to know right now, before we go back in there and I issue this challenge, that you understand what you're agreeing to, that if I win this fight, then you're mine completely. No more pretending you're just my secretary. No more keeping distance between us. No more denying that you belong with me in every way that matters. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think, barely process the enormity of what he was asking, what he was offering, what he was demanding. But when I looked at him, really looked at the man who was willing to fight and possibly die to keep me safe, I knew there was only one answer I could give. I understand, I said softly, crossing to him and placing my hand over his on the door handle, feeling the way his fingers twitched at the contact. Win this fight, Dante. Bring my sister home safe, and I'm yours, whatever that means, whatever darkness comes with it, whatever price I have to pay for being loved by someone like you. His smile was fierce and triumphant, and he pulled me against him for one brief, searing kiss that felt like a promise and a claim all at once, before releasing me and opening the door, striding back into the negotiation room with me following close behind, my heart in my throat, as I prepared to watch him issue a challenge that would determine all of our fates. Volkov looked up with that same cold smile as we returned to the table, clearly expecting us to have reached some kind of compromise, to have agreed to his terms like reasonable people who understood how negotiations worked in their world. But Dante didn't sit back down, didn't resume his casual posture, instead standing at the head of the table with a commanding presence that made every man in the room straighten slightly in their chairs. I reject your terms, Volkov, Dante said clearly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. And instead I invoke the right of trial by combat to settle this dispute. One-on-one, traditional rules, and the winner takes all. If I win, you release Maya Bennett immediately and unharmed. You withdraw all claims on Ilara and her family permanently. And you acknowledge that she is under my protection, and therefore untouchable by you or anyone in your organization. He paused, letting the challenge hang in the air, and I watched Volkov's expression shift from surprise to calculation to something that looked almost like anticipation. And if you win, which you won't, you get the 3 districts you asked for, you get assurance of non-retaliation, and you get whatever sick satisfaction you were hoping to derive from having power over something I care about. But you don't get Ilara herself because I'd die before I let that happen. And I think we both know that's not a metaphor. The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as Volkov's men and the neutral parties who'd been observing the negotiation processed this unexpected turn, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for Volkov's response, praying that he would accept because the alternative was unthinkable. Volkov stood slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Dante, the 2 men sizing each other up like prize fighters before a match, and I could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity. You know I can't refuse a properly issued challenge without losing face with every organization in this city, Volkov said finally, and there was something dark and pleased in his expression that made my stomach drop. And I accept your terms, Valentino, but I want you to know something before we shake on this and make it official. I've been training in combat sports since I was 6 years old. I've killed more men with my bare hands than you've probably killed with guns, and I'm going to enjoy breaking you in front of your precious secretary, making her watch as I destroy the man she's clearly fallen for. And then when I win, when I take everything you've offered, I'm going to make sure she understands exactly what it costs to be associated with someone foolish enough to challenge me. He extended his hand, and I watched in horror as Dante gripped it, sealing the agreement that would determine our futures. And the smile on Volkov's face was the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. 3 days, then, Dante said, coldly, releasing Volkov's hand and turning to leave, pulling me with him as his men fell into formation around us, creating a protective barrier between us and Volkov's organization. And Volkov, one more thing you should know before we part ways. I don't just fight to win. I fight to utterly destroy anyone who threatens what's mine. So I'd suggest you spend these 3 days making peace with whatever god you believe in. Because when I'm done with you, you're going to wish you'd never heard the name Ilara Bennett. We left the restaurant in tense silence, surrounded by Dante's men, and it wasn't until we were back in his car, speeding through Chicago's streets toward his penthouse, that I finally let myself process what had just happened, what Dante had just committed himself to for my sake. He's going to try to kill you, I whispered, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest since the moment Volkov accepted the challenge. Not just beat you, but actually kill you in that fight, because that's the only way he wins completely. And Dante, I can't lose you. I can't watch you die because of me and my family's problems. He pulled me against his side, his arm wrapping around me as the car navigated through traffic. And when I looked up at him, his expression was absolutely certain, utterly confident in a way that should have reassured me but instead just made me more terrified of how much he was willing to risk. Then don't watch, he said simply, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Because in 3 days, I'm going to show Volkov and everyone else in this city exactly what happens when someone threatens to take what belongs to Dante Valentino. And Ilara, when it's over, when your sister is safe and you're permanently mine, I'm going to make you understand exactly how much you mean to me, how far I'm willing to go to keep you, and why falling in love with a man like me is the most dangerous and the most protected you'll ever be in your entire life. Dante trained for the fight like a man possessed, his body moving through brutal combat sequences in his private gym with a savage grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing to watch. But every evening, he'd come to me covered in bruises that bloomed across his ribs and sweat that made his skin gleam under the lights, and I'd patch him up with trembling hands, terrified that in 3 days I might lose the only man I'd ever loved, a man I couldn't even admit my feelings to, because what if speaking them aloud made losing him hurt more, made the possibility of his death feel more real and devastating than it already did? I found myself living in a constant state of suspended anxiety, watching the hours tick down like a countdown to either salvation or complete destruction. And every time Dante's phone rang with updates from his men, who were monitoring Maya's location and condition, my heart would leap into my throat with hope and dread in equal measure. The first night after the challenge, I couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion that pulled at my bones, and I found myself wandering through Dante's penthouse in one of his shirts that fell to mid-thigh, feeling simultaneously like an intruder, and like I somehow belonged in this space that reflected his personality in every carefully chosen piece of furniture and artwork. I discovered him on the balcony, standing at the railing and looking out over the city he controlled with such absolute authority. And when I approached, he didn't turn but simply opened his arm in invitation, pulling me against his side when I accepted, wrapping me in his warmth and the lingering scent of the expensive soap he used after training. "Tell me about her," I said quietly, surprising myself with the request. But suddenly I needed to know more about the woman who had shaped him, who had loved him before the world taught him to be hard and dangerous. "Tell me about your mother, about who you were before all of this, because I need to understand what made you into the man who would risk everything for someone like me." His arm tightened around me, and I felt rather than saw the way he tensed at the question, clearly not accustomed to sharing pieces of his past with anyone. But after a long moment of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city below, he began to speak in a voice rough with old grief. "She was everything good in my life, everything soft and kind in a world that was already showing me its brutal nature. And she used to make me chamomile tea and tell me stories about the old country, about a place where men didn't solve their problems with violence and children didn't have to learn to fight before they learned to read. His hand came up to stroke my hair, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence he was capable of. My father was in the life, as they say, already building the organization that I would eventually inherit. And she hated it. Hated what it was doing to him. Hated that I was being groomed to follow in his footsteps instead of being allowed to be a normal boy with normal dreams, but she loved us anyway. Loved us with a fierce protectiveness that couldn't quite shield us from the darkness that was always waiting. I pressed closer to him, sensing that this story didn't have a happy ending. That the woman he was describing with such painful tenderness was the ghost that haunted every decision he made, every wall he built around his heart. What happened to her? I asked softly, even though I already knew the answer would hurt. Would explain so much about the man holding me. The Antonelli family happened, he said, and his voice went cold in a way that made me shiver despite the warmth of his body. They were trying to take territory from my father, trying to force him into a bad deal by targeting his family. And they came to our house one evening when my father was out handling business, when it was just me and my mother having dinner and talking about my grades at school like we were a normal family living a normal life. His breathing had changed, become harsher, and I could feel the tension radiating through him as he continued. I was 16, old enough to know I should protect her but not trained enough to actually do it, and I had to watch as they beat her, as they hurt her in ways I'm not going to describe to you, and then they shot her in front of me as a message to my father, leaving me alive specifically so I could tell him what happened, so I could deliver their ultimatum about surrendering territory, or watching the rest of his family die the same way. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I turned in his arms to press my face against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath my cheek. Grateful that he was alive, that he had survived that trauma, and become someone capable of protecting others, even if the cost was becoming something dark and dangerous himself. "I'm so sorry," I whispered against his skin, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "I'm sorry you had to experience that, had to carry that memory, and I understand now why you do what you do, why you protect what's yours with such absolute certainty, because you know what it feels like to lose someone important and be powerless to stop it." His arms wrapped around me completely, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I felt his lips press against the top of my head. "I killed them all," he said quietly, and there was no remorse in his voice, only a cold satisfaction that spoke of justice delivered in the brutal currency of his world. It took me 2 years, 2 years of training and planning, and becoming exactly the kind of monster my mother never wanted me to be. But I hunted down every single member of the Antonelli family who was involved in her death, and I made sure they understood exactly why they were dying before I ended them. He pulled back slightly to look down at me, and in the moonlight his face was all sharp angles and shadows. "So when I tell you that I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, when I say that I'll burn down Volkov's entire organization, if that's what it takes to keep you and your sister safe, you need to understand that I'm not speaking metaphorically, that I'm fully capable of and willing to commit whatever violence is necessary, because I already failed to protect someone I loved once, and I will not, cannot, let that happen again." The intensity of his declaration, the raw emotion beneath his words, made something crack open inside my chest, and I found myself reaching up to cup his face with both hands, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Then you need to understand something too, Dante Valentino," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "I can't lose you either, can't watch you die in that arena fighting for me, because somewhere in the past 3 days, somewhere between you finding me crying in your closet and you declaring war for my sister, and you sharing the most painful parts of your past with me, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you. And the thought of living in a world where you don't exist is more terrifying than anything Volkov could possibly do to me." For a long moment he just stared at me, his gray eyes searching my face as if trying to determine whether I was telling the truth, whether I really meant the words I'd just spoken. And then he was kissing me with a desperate intensity, that stole my breath and made my knees weak, his hands tangling in my hair as he took my mouth like he was trying to claim every part of me, like he was trying to brand himself into my soul. When we finally broke apart, both gasping for air, he pressed his forehead against mine and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "Say it again," he demanded, his hands gripping my hips hard enough to bruise. "Say you love me again, because I need to hear it, need to believe that something as good and pure as you could actually love something as dark and damaged as me." "I love you," I repeated, and this time the words came easier, felt right and true and inevitable. "I love you, Dante, and I need you to promise me that you're going to win this fight, that you're going to come back to me alive and whole, because I just found you and I'm not ready to let you go. Not now, not ever." His smile was fierce and possessive, and full of dark promise. "Then I'll win," he said simply, as if it was already decided, as if the outcome was inevitable. "I'll win because losing isn't an option when you're what I'm fighting for. And Alara, when this is over, when your sister is safe and Volkov is nothing but a bad memory, I'm going to marry you, going to make you my wife in every legal and traditional way possible, because I don't just want to protect you, I want to own you, to keep you, to make sure that everyone in this city knows you're mine permanently." The possessiveness in his words should have frightened me, should have triggered all my independent instincts about not belonging to anyone. But instead I felt only a warm certainty spreading through my chest, a rightness about being claimed by this dangerous, damaged, devoted man. "Then win," I said firmly, rising on my toes to kiss him again. "Win and make me yours because I'm tired of being afraid, tired of struggling alone, and I want what you're offering even if it comes wrapped in darkness and danger." We made love that night on his massive bed, with a desperate intensity that felt like both a promise and a goodbye, and I tried to memorize every touch, every whispered word, every moment of connection, terrified that I might be creating memories I'd have to survive on if the worst happened. Dante worshipped my body with a reverence that made tears stream down my face, taking his time to explore every inch of me, like he was trying to memorize me too. And when he finally pushed inside me, filling me completely, I wrapped my legs around his waist and held on like he was my anchor in a storm, like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become uncertain and terrifying. The next 2 days passed in a blur of training sessions that I watched with my heart in my throat, of stolen moments where Dante would pull me close and kiss me like he couldn't help himself, of phone calls with Marco updating us on Maya's condition and Volkov's preparations for the fight. I learned more about Dante's world during those 48 hours than I had in 8 months of working for him, meeting his inner circle properly, understanding the complex network of loyalty and obligation that held his organization together, and realizing that these dangerous men who lived by violence respected their boss, not just because they feared him, but because he commanded their genuine loyalty through his own brand of brutal honor. On the morning of the fight, I woke to find Dante already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at nothing, and I could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his hands were clenched into fists on his thighs. I crawled across the bed to wrap myself around him from behind, pressing my cheek against his bare back and feeling his heart racing beneath my palm. "What are you thinking about?" I asked quietly, afraid of the answer but needing to know what was going through his mind on the day that would determine everything. "I'm thinking about all the ways this could go wrong," he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice broke my heart, because this was Dante Valentino, the man who never showed weakness, never admitted to fear, letting me see beneath the armor to the scared, determined man underneath. "I'm thinking about what happens to you if I lose, about whether Marco will be able to get you and Maya out of the city before Volkov's men find you, about all the promises I've made that I might not be able to keep. And Alara, I need you to promise me something. Need you to swear that if the worst happens, you'll run. You'll take your sister and the money Marco will give you, and you'll disappear somewhere Volkov can never find you." I tightened my arms around him, refusing to let him prepare for failure, refusing to accept a future that didn't include him. "No," I said firmly, and I felt him stiffen in surprise. "I'm not promising that because you're going to win, Dante. You're going to beat Volkov and bring Maya home and make me your wife like you promised. And I won't entertain any other possibility because if I start preparing for you to lose, then I'm already giving up on you, and I will never, never give up on the man I love." He turned in my arms then, pulling me onto his lap and crushing me against his chest, and I felt his whole body shaking with emotion that he usually kept locked away. "If I don't make it back," he started, but I cut him off by pressing my hand over his mouth, physically stopping the words I refused to hear. "Come back to me alive," I said, my voice breaking, but determined. "That's all I want to hear from you right now, that you're going to come back to me alive and whole and ready to start the life we talked about. Because anything else is unacceptable, do you understand me, Dante Valentino?" His smile was sad and beautiful and full of love that he'd probably never expected to feel again. "I love you, Ilara Bennett," he said, the words simple but weighted with everything he felt, everything he was promising. "I love you, and if I don't make it back, I need you to know that these past few days with you, getting to hold you and kiss you and hear you say you love me, have been the best days of my entire life, worth every terrible thing I've had to do, every piece of my soul I've had to sacrifice to survive in this world." "Don't," I whispered desperately, tears streaming down my face now because he was saying goodbye, was preparing for an outcome I couldn't accept. "Don't say goodbye to me, Dante, because if you do, then I'm going to fall apart completely, and I need to be strong right now. Need to believe that this isn't the last time I'll hold you like this." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and devastating, and I could taste the salt of my own tears mixed with something else, something that might have been his tears too, though I'd never ask, because men like Dante Valentino didn't cry, didn't show that kind of vulnerability even to the women they loved. When he finally pulled away, the mask had slipped back into place, the ruthless Mafia boss emerging to prepare for battle. But I could still see traces of the vulnerable man underneath, the one who loved me and was terrified of failing me. The warehouse where the fight was being held was in a neutral territory, overseen by representatives from 3 other major organizations who would ensure fair play and enforce the traditional rules that govern trials by combat. And as Dante's car pulled up to the building, surrounded by vehicles full of his men, I felt my stomach clench with fear so intense it was almost nauseating. Marco opened my door, offering his hand to help me out, and I could see the concern in his scarred face, the way he looked at me like he was already grieving for what might happen today. "He's going to win," Marco said quietly as we walked toward the entrance, and I couldn't tell if he was trying to convince me or himself. "I've known Dante for 15 years, fought beside him in situations where the odds were worse than this, and I've never seen him lose when he's fighting for something important. And Miss Bennett, you need to understand that he's never had anything as important as you, which means he's never been this motivated to survive." The interior of the warehouse had been cleared and set up like a makeshift arena, with a large circle marked on the concrete floor and raised seating areas where representatives from various organizations sat watching with the detached interest of people who saw violence as entertainment. Volkov was already there, stripped to the waist and stretching with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before, and I could see the scars that crisscrossed his torso, evidence of previous fights and battles that he'd survived or won. Dante stripped off his shirt as well, and I couldn't help the small gasp that escaped me at the sight of his body, all hard muscle and coiled strength, bearing its own collection of scars that told the story of his violent life. And when he looked over at me, his eyes found mine across the warehouse with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. They called me forward then, had me stand between the 2 fighters as a neutral party read the terms of the combat, and I forced myself to look at both men, to understand exactly what was about to happen. what they were about to do to each other in my name. The fight continues until one participant yields or is rendered unable to continue, the official was saying, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. No weapons beyond the fighter's own body, no interference from outside parties, and the winner's terms will be honored immediately and completely by all present organizations under penalty of becoming outcast from our entire network. Volkov smiled at me, cold and predatory, and I saw his gaze slide deliberately down my body in a way that made my skin crawl. "I hope you're prepared for what comes after, Miss Bennett," he said softly, pitched just loud enough for Dante to hear. "Because when I win, when I take you as part of my prize, I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what it means to belong to someone who isn't weak enough to love you, who sees you for what you really are, which is just another possession to be used and enjoyed." I watched Dante's expression transform into something absolutely murderous. Saw the way his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white, and I knew that Volkov had just made a fatal mistake by threatening me so explicitly, by making his intentions so clear. "You're not going to touch her," Dante said in a voice that promised death. "You're not going to speak to her, you're not going to look at her, and you're certainly not going to survive this fight, because I'm going to break every bone in your body for what you just said, for what you implied, for thinking even for a second that you could have what's mine." They separated us then, moving me to a viewing area where Marco and several of Dante's other men formed a protective barrier around me, and I gripped the railing in front of me so hard my knuckles ached as I watched the two men circle each other in the marked arena. The first exchange of blows came fast and brutal, Volkov striking with professional precision while Dante blocked and countered with raw power. And I realized with growing horror that this wasn't going to be a quick fight, that both men were skilled enough and motivated enough to make this long and bloody and absolutely devastating to watch. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I watched the man I loved take hits that would have dropped lesser men, saw blood streaming from a cut above his eye, watched him stagger from a kick that caught him in the ribs with enough force that I heard something crack even from where I stood. But Dante kept fighting, kept moving forward with a determination that bordered on supernatural, and every time Volkov thought he had the advantage, Dante would rally with a combination of strikes that drove the other man back, that proved he wasn't finished, wasn't beaten, wasn't ready to give up on the future he'd promised me. I couldn't watch and couldn't look away, trapped in a horrible limbo where every blow that landed made me flinch, made me want to scream at them to stop, to call off this barbaric ritual and find another way to settle our problems. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost ignored it until I saw it was a message from an unknown number. And when I opened it, my blood ran cold because it was a video of Maya, more bruised than before, with a man's hand gripping her hair as a voice off camera spoke in accented English. "Your champion is losing, Miss Bennett," the voice said, and I realized with dawning horror that this was one of Volkov's men who was supposed to be guarding Maya, who was supposed to be waiting for the fight's outcome before doing anything. "And my boss has given me new instructions. If it looks like he's going to lose, if your precious Dante manages to win after all, I'm to kill your sister anyway and dispose of the body where it will never be found, because Sergei Volkov doesn't believe in honoring agreements with men who publicly humiliate him, which means no matter what happens in that arena, your sister dies unless you do exactly what I tell you to do in the next 60 seconds. The warehouse where the fight was held reeked of blood, sweat, and gunpowder. And as I watched Dante and Volkov circle each other like predators through a haze of tears and terror, I clutched the small pistol Marco had pressed into my hand when I'd shown him the threatening video, knowing that in the next few minutes, either the man I loved would die, or I would break every rule I'd ever lived by to save both him and my sister, or we would all perish together in this brutal arena that had become the stage for our desperate battle against a world that seemed determined to destroy everything I held dear. The gun felt impossibly heavy in my trembling grip, cold metal that represented a line I'd never thought I would cross. But as I watched Dante take another devastating blow that sent him stumbling backward, blood streaming from multiple cuts on his face and torso, I realized that love had transformed me into someone capable of violence, someone willing to do whatever it took to protect the people who mattered most. And the revelation was both terrifying and strangely empowering. Marco's phone buzzed with a message, and I watched, his expression darken as he read whatever intelligence his men had just sent him. And when he leaned close to whisper in my ear, his words confirmed my worst fears and my desperate plan simultaneously. Volkov's men at the warehouse where Maya is being held just received orders to eliminate her regardless of the fight's outcome, he said urgently, his hand gripping my shoulder with enough force to ground me in this moment. They're planning to kill her and dispose of the evidence within the next 10 minutes, which means we need to move now, need to send a team to extract her immediately. But Miss Bennett, you need to understand that if we pull men from here to rescue your sister, we leave Dante more vulnerable to Volkov's organization, potentially breaking the rules and interfering in the fight. The choice stretched before me like a chasm, impossible and cruel, forcing me to decide between the man I loved and the sister I'd raised, between Dante's life and Maya's, between honoring the brutal traditions of this world and doing whatever it took to save my family. I looked down at the arena where Dante had just landed a series of brutal strikes that sent Volkov reeling backward, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. And I saw the determination in every line of Dante's body, the absolute refusal to give up or give in that had carried him through countless battles and impossible situations, and I made my decision with a clarity that came from finally understanding exactly who I'd become since walking into this world. "Send your men to save Maya now," I said firmly, watching Marco's eyes widen in surprise at my tone, at the authority I'd somehow found in the midst of chaos. "Send everyone you can spare to that warehouse and get my sister out alive, because Dante is going to win this fight with or without extra security, and Marco, I need you to trust me when I say that I'm not going to let anything happen to him, that I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he survives this, even if it means becoming exactly the kind of person who pulls a trigger without hesitation." Marco stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to assess whether I was serious, whether I was actually capable of using the weapon he'd given me. And whatever he saw in my face must have convinced him, because he nodded sharply and started barking orders into his phone, dispatching men to rescue Maya, while the remaining security tightened their formation around our viewing area. Down in the arena, the fight had reached a critical point, both men bloodied and exhausted but still trading blows with a viciousness that spoke of deep hatred and absolute determination. And I found myself leaning forward, my entire being focused on Dante's movements, on the way he was favoring his left side, where Volkov's kicks had clearly damaged his ribs, on the slight limp that suggested his knee was compromised, on all the small signs that he was hurt badly but refusing to show it. Volkov must have sensed weakness because he suddenly pressed his advantage, launching a brutal combination of strikes that drove Dante backward toward the edge of the marked circle. And I watched in horror as my love stumbled, his guard dropping for just a moment, giving Volkov the opening he needed to grab Dante in a chokehold that threatened to end the fight right there. The crowd of criminal representatives leaned forward with interest, sensing the conclusion approaching, and I could see some of them already exchanging glances that suggested they were calculating how Volkov's victory would shift the power dynamics in Chicago's underworld, how Dante Valentino's fall would create opportunities for ambitious men to seize territory and influence. But I knew something they didn't, had seen something in Dante's eyes just before Volkov grabbed him, a flash of cold calculation that suggested this was exactly what he wanted, that he'd deliberately created this opening to lure his opponent into overconfidence. Sure enough, as Volkov tightened his grip, clearly planning to choke Dante unconscious, Dante's hands came up not to pry at the arms around his neck, but to grip Volkov's head. And with a savage twist that made me gasp, he used leverage and momentum to flip the larger man over his shoulder, slamming him into the concrete with enough force that the impact echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. And suddenly their positions were reversed, with Dante on top and raining down blows with a fury that spoke of every threat Volkov had made, every crude comment about me, every moment of terror I'd experienced because of this man's greed and cruelty. The fight should have ended there, should have concluded with Dante's obvious dominance and Volkov's inability to defend himself effectively. But I caught movement in my peripheral vision, saw one of Volkov's men reaching inside his jacket in a way that suggested he was about to break the sacred rules of single combat by interfering with a weapon. Everything seemed to slow down as I realized what was about to happen, understood that they were going to shoot Dante while he was focused on finishing Volkov, that all the traditional protections and neutral observers wouldn't matter, because by the time anyone reacted, Dante would already be dead, and I would lose everything that mattered in a moment of treachery that this brutal world should have prevented, but somehow hadn't. The pistol Marco had given me came up without conscious thought. Muscle memory from a self-defense class I'd taken years ago, combining with desperate love and absolute refusal to lose Dante after everything we'd been through. And I fired 3 times in rapid succession, the recoil shocking against my palms, but my aim steady enough that at least one bullet found its target, striking Volkov's man in the shoulder and sending his own weapon clattering to the concrete as he screamed and fell backward. Chaos erupted immediately as other organizations' representatives drew their own weapons as Dante's remaining men moved to secure the area, as everyone tried to understand what had just happened and whether the rules had been broken in a way that invalidated the entire combat. And through it all, I stood frozen with the smoking gun in my hands, unable to believe I'd actually shot someone, unable to process the violence I'd just committed, even though I knew with absolute certainty that I'd do it again if it meant keeping Dante alive. Dante's head had snapped up at the sound of gunfire, his eyes finding mine across the warehouse with an expression that cycled through shock and pride and possessive satisfaction in the space of a heartbeat. And I watched as he deliberately, almost casually, delivered one final devastating blow to Volkov's face that left the man unconscious and bleeding on the concrete floor. The neutral observers were arguing loudly about whether my intervention had violated the terms of combat, whether Dante's victory was legitimate given that outside forces had prevented what would have been outside interference anyway, creating a circular logic problem that threatened to invalidate everything we'd fought for. But before they could reach any conclusion, Marco's phone rang, and I watched his expression transform from tense concern to visible relief. "We have Maya," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice cutting through the arguments and debates. "Dante's men successfully extracted Miss Bennett's sister from Volkov's warehouse, and she's currently en route to a secure medical facility where she'll be treated for her injuries and reunited with her family. Which means, regardless of any technicalities about the fight itself, Dante Valentino has achieved his primary objective of protecting what belongs to him. And I would suggest that any organization considering challenging that outcome remember that we're discussing a man who just won single combat while his enemies attempted treachery, a man whose woman shot an armed attacker to protect him, and a man whose loyalty from his organization is absolute enough that we'd go to war over any attempt to deny him his victory." The threat was clear and unambiguous, and I watched the neutral observers exchange glances before the head representative, an older man with calculating eyes, stepped forward to make the official declaration. "The combat is concluded with Dante Valentino as the victor, both through his dominance in the arena and through the fact that his opponent's organization violated the sacred rules by attempting armed interference, which means all terms agreed upon are now in effect immediately," he announced, and I felt my knees go weak with relief so profound it was almost painful. Sergei Volkov's organization will release all claims on Ilara Bennett and her family, will withdraw from disputed territories, and will accept that any further aggression toward Dante Valentino or his interests will result in their complete ostracism from Chicago's organized community. Dante was already moving toward me, climbing out of the arena with visible effort, his body clearly damaged, but his spirit unbroken. And when he reached me, he didn't say anything, just pulled me into his arms with enough force to make me gasp, burying his face in my hair as his whole body shook with adrenaline and emotion and the aftermath of nearly dying for me. "You shot someone," he murmured against my ear, and I could hear the wonder and dark pleasure in his voice, the satisfaction of knowing I'd been willing to cross that line for him. My beautiful, gentle Ilara pulled a trigger to protect me, became exactly the kind of dangerous woman who belongs at my side. And sweetheart, I've never been more in love with you than I am right now, knowing that you'll fight for us just as hard as I will. I was crying openly now, my hands running over his battered body, as if to convince myself he was really alive, really whole enough to survive what had just happened. And I could taste blood when I kissed him desperately, unable to articulate everything I was feeling, but needing him to understand through touch what words couldn't convey. "Is it over?" I asked against his lips, afraid to believe that we'd actually won, that Maya was safe and Dante was alive and we could finally start the future he'd promised me. Is it really over, or is there going to be more violence, more threats, more impossible choices between the people I love? His hands came up to frame my face, forcing me to meet his eyes, which were blazing with possessive intensity, despite the exhaustion and pain I could see etched into every line of his features. "It's over," he said firmly, and the certainty in his voice made me believe him. "Volkov's organization is finished in this city after what happened today, after they broke sacred rules and lost their leader's credibility by attempting treachery, and everyone else will remember what happened to the people who tried to use you against me, which means you and Maya are safe now, protected not just by me but by the reputation we've built together, by the fear and respect that comes from knowing I'll burn the world down for you, and you'll shoot anyone who threatens what's ours." Marco approached then, helping support Dante's weight as the adrenaline wore off and the pain of his injuries became more apparent, and I moved to his other side automatically, letting him lean on both of us as we made our way out of the warehouse toward waiting vehicles. "The hospital has your sister in a private room," Marco reported, his tone professional despite the concern I could see in his eyes as he assessed his boss's condition. "She's dehydrated and has some bruising and minor injuries, but nothing permanent, nothing that won't heal completely with time and proper care. And she's been asking for you since we brought her in, Miss Bennett, wanting to make sure you're safe, wanting to understand what happened and why her sister's boss went to war with a rival organization over her kidnapping." The mention of Maya, the knowledge that she was alive and relatively unharmed and waiting for me, made fresh tears stream down my face, and I felt Dante's arm tighten around my waist as if he understood exactly what I was feeling. The overwhelming relief and gratitude and desperate need to see my sister with my own eyes. "Take us to her," I said, looking up at Marco with an expression that must have conveyed my urgency, because he immediately started barking orders to speed up our departure, to secure the route to the hospital, to make sure that our reunion would be safe and private and uninterrupted by anyone seeking to capitalize on our vulnerable moment. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of Dante's men, checking his injuries, arguing about whether he needed immediate medical attention, despite his insistence that seeing Maya first was more important, and me sitting pressed against his side with his hand gripping mine like he couldn't bear to let me go even for a moment. When we finally arrived and made our way through private corridors to the room where Maya was being kept, I felt my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst, and the moment I saw her sitting up in the hospital bed, alive and whole despite the bruises marking her face and arms, I broke away from Dante and ran to her, throwing myself into her arms and sobbing with a relief so profound it felt like something inside me had finally unlocked after days of being held in terrified suspension. "Ilara," Maya whispered, her own tears mixing with mine as we held each other with desperate intensity. "What happened? What did you do? Because these men came in shooting, and they told me I was being rescued on Dante Valentino's orders, and I don't understand how my sister, who works as a secretary, somehow got Chicago's most dangerous crime boss to start a war over me." She pulled back to look at me properly, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance, the expensive dress now stained with Dante's blood, the gun I'd forgotten I was still holding tucked into Marco's shoulder holster, the way I kept glancing back at Dante, who stood in the doorway watching us with possessive satisfaction. "Oh my God," she breathed, understanding dawning in her expression. "You're in love with him. You're actually in love with your Mafia boss, and he went to war for you, didn't he? Because you're not just his secretary anymore, you're his woman. And Ilara, Do you have any idea how insane and romantic and completely terrifying that is? I laughed through my tears, the sound slightly hysterical but genuine, and I reached back to grab Dante's hand, pulling him forward into the room so Maya could see him properly, could understand the man who'd saved her life and claimed her sister's heart in equal measure. Maya, this is Dante Valentino. And yes, I'm completely in love with him. And yes, he started a war to save you because you're important to me, and everything that's important to me is important to him now, I said, watching my sister's eyes go wide as she took in Dante's battered appearance, the evidence of what he'd endured to win her freedom. And I know this is insane and probably the worst decision I've ever made from a purely logical standpoint. But Maya, he makes me feel safe and cherished, and like I finally have someone who will stand beside me against the world, and I'm going to marry him and become part of his life permanently. And I need you to understand that and accept it because you're the only family I have left, and I need your blessing even though I'm going to do this regardless of whether you give it. Maya stared at us for a long moment, clearly processing everything I'd said, everything that had changed in the past few days since she'd been taken. And then slowly, carefully, she smiled despite the pain it must have caused her bruised face. If he makes you happy, if he protects you the way he protected me by sending all those men and risking a war with Volkov's organization, then I'm not going to stand in your way, she said softly. And then her gaze shifted to Dante directly, her expression becoming surprisingly fierce for someone who'd just been rescued from a kidnapping. But Mr. Valentino, you need to understand that Ilara is the best person I know, the woman who raised me and sacrificed everything for me. And if you ever hurt her, if you ever make her regret loving you, I will find a way to make you pay for it, regardless of how dangerous you are or how much power you have. Because that's what family does. We protect each other even from people who are supposed to love us. Dante's smile was genuine and full of respect as he looked at my sister, and I watched him move closer to the bed, his hand never leaving mine. I would expect nothing less from Ilara's sister, he said seriously, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. And Maya, I want you to know that you're under my protection now too, permanently, which means no one will ever threaten you or harm you again without answering to me. And I'll make sure you have everything you need to finish your education and build whatever life you want without the burden of your father's debts, or the fear of people like Volkov ever touching you again, because you're family now, and I protect my family with everything I have. 6 months later, I stood in front of floor-to-ceiling windows in what had become our home office, the Chicago skyline stretching out before me in the late afternoon light, and I marveled at how completely my life had transformed from that day I'd hidden crying in Dante's closet, broken and desperate and certain that my world was ending. Maya was thriving in college now, studying business and living in a secure apartment that Dante's men monitored discreetly, and she visited us every weekend for family dinners where she and Dante had developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared protectiveness of me and her genuine interest in the legitimate business operations he was gradually expanding. The wedding had been small but beautiful, held in the penthouse with only our closest people present, and I still caught myself staring at the ring on my finger sometimes, unable to believe that I was actually Mrs. Valentino, that I'd married into darkness and danger and somehow found more happiness than I'd ever imagined possible. I felt Dante's arms wrap around me from behind, his hands coming to rest on my growing belly where our child grew, the physical evidence of the love that had saved us both from the lonely, violent paths we'd been walking before fate brought us together. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against my neck, and I leaned back into his embrace, letting his strength and warmth surround me like it always did, like it always would for the rest of our lives. "I'm thinking about how the worst day of my life, crying in that closet broken and desperate and certain I'd lost everything, somehow led me here, to this dangerous, powerful, beautiful love that saved us both," I said softly, turning in his arms to face him properly, to see the man who'd fought for me and claimed me and built me a life where I was cherished and protected, and utterly his. I'm thinking about how sometimes the darkest moments become doorways to light we never expected to find, and how falling in love with a man like you was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most right decision I've ever made. Because, Dante, you've given me everything I never knew I needed, everything I was too afraid to hope for, and I would do it all again, would walk through that darkness and fear and violence 1,000 times if it meant ending up here with you. His smile was tender and possessive in equal measure, and he cupped my face with both hands, his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that still made my breath catch even after all these months together. Then we're even, my love. Because you walked into my life and brought light into darkness, brought hope into despair, and reminded me that even monsters can be redeemed by the right woman's love, he said. And then he kissed me with the same fierce devotion he'd shown from the beginning, the same promise that he would always protect what was his, that he would always fight for our future, that he would love me with the same intensity whether we were facing down enemies or simply standing in our home, watching the sun set over the city that had witnessed our violent beginning and would bear witness to whatever came next. And Alara, I need you to know that every day with you is the best day of my life, that you and our growing family are worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of darkness I've endured, because loving you has made me believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that even someone like me deserves happiness. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me, choosing this life, choosing to love a man who would burn the world down to keep you safe and whole and utterly his. As I stood there in his arms, our child moving beneath my hand, Maya's laughter drifting up from the kitchen where she was attempting to cook dinner under Marco's amused supervision, the city we'd claimed together spreading out before us in all its dangerous beauty, I understood with perfect clarity that this was exactly where I was meant to be, that sometimes love requires us to embrace darkness to find our truest light, and that the most powerful romances are the ones that transform us into better, braver, more complete versions of ourselves through the alchemy of being loved and loving in return, no matter how dangerous or unconventional the path that brought us together might have been.